Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. It's great to have you with us for another episode of our show. Today's promises to be really relevant and pretty timely and serious subject, so I don't want to waste any time. Let me bring on my friend and colleague, the host of our show, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen.
Jean Marie Nevada, how are you?
I'm doing well. Like most people in California, I am looking out the window, wondering if we're actually going to get rain, which sounds weird, but in California, that's kind of a big deal.
I feel like the air outside my house, because I'm also Los Angeles based, is so thick and I can feel it yearning. Like if weather could yearn, I feel that it is yearning to rain, and yet not quite achieving goals today.
We still have 2 more days of hope.
Oh, good Lord. I'll stay hopeful for the rain.
Thank you, Liz. I will see you later.
Have a great show.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National, and every single week for, oh my goodness, we've done this over 100 weeks. We get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week we are talking about, as Liz said, something really serious. So September 4th through the 10th is National Suicide Prevention Week. So that is going to be the center of our conversation, especially because there's some pretty exciting news about new resources out there. So as usual, we are sharing an article so you can learn a little bit more about what is happening outside your door. And this week's article is from the Washington Post, done by Julianne McShane. And the title of it is Experts Hope LGBTQ Youth Will Call 988, a new suicide lifeline number. The article does talk about the 988 hotline, which is much easier to access than the longer previous number. And there also has been a significant amount of money allocated to these resources, about $105 million by the Biden administration initially. But there are a lot of questions about what this line does and some of the challenges around it and how people need to understand what exactly happens when you call. The nice thing is that when we need help at PFLAG, we have lots of really smart, awesome people to help us out that we can call. And so this week we have 2 great guests. And let me just quickly tell you about them before we bring them in. We have Preston Mitchum, who is the Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project, and Doreen Marshall, who is the Vice President of Mission Engagement at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So I'd like to welcome them both to the show. Hello, my friends. Thank you for being here. I am so excited that you're both here. So before we go any further, for people who may not be familiar with your organizations or one or the other, I'd love to hear you tell people a quick snapshot of what your organizations do and what you do there. And Preston, maybe you can go first.
Sure, I'm happy to. So first off, thanks so much for having me today. It is a pleasure to speak with you, Doreen, and the PFLAG audience on what we know is an important topic. So I'm Preston Mitchum. I use he, him pronouns. And as you said, I'm the Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project. And for those who don't know, the Trevor Project is the world's largest suicide prevention and mental health organization for LGBTQ young people. We offer a suite of 24/7, 365 crisis intervention and suicide prevention programs that includes a few things, right? Including Trevor Lifeline, Trevor Text, and Trevor Chat, as well as our world's largest social safe space networking site for LGBTQ youth called Trevor Space. The last thing I'll say here is our crisis counselors can be reached at thetrevorproject.org/get-help or call us at 1-866-488-7386 or text START, that's START, to 678-678.
Thank you so much, Preston. I also need to mention that Trevor Project puts out some unbelievable research and polling that is so important and I think gives people so much direction. So thank you for everything that you're doing. And Doreen, returning to our show, tell us a little bit about American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and your role there.
Thanks, Jean Marie. It's great to be back with you. Hi, Preston. At AFSP, we are the largest private funder of suicide prevention research in the United States. We are a grassroots organization. We have chapters in all 50 states, and our mission really is to provide hope and support for those impacted by suicide. So we have education programs, we do advocacy, we obviously fund research, like I mentioned, and we also do loss support for those who have been impacted by the suicide of someone that they love. So lots of work at AFSP. My role there, I'm the Vice President of Mission Engagement and a psychologist by training. And so what I do is I work on a lot of our content or our external messaging, and also interface with partners at events like this.
Thank you both so much. So, Preston, one of the conversations that I feel like I can't escape and a lot of us can't escape is how much more visibility and in many ways acceptance there are for people who are LGBTQ, which on the surface, one would assume would translate into better mental health outcomes for those in our community, particularly for youth. But that doesn't seem to be the case entirely too often. And in some cases, we're actually seeing a backslide on some of that progress that we've been making. So why is this happening? We should be moving forward, and yet we're not. And it's kind of a scary time, which is what brings us to this very conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because, so often we talk about the visibility piece, but sometimes not what can happen or what results flow therefrom or what can flow therefrom. And I'll start by saying it's truly wonderful to see increasing visibility and societal acceptance for LGBTQ plus communities in this moment. And it's important for us to understand that greater visibility and acceptance does not always equal greater rights and even legal protections for many of us. One of my favorite articles is by someone by the name of Brandon Tinsley, who wrote The Double-Edged Sword of Queer Visibility. And I lifted a particular statement because in it he says, quote, "This is hardly a call to duck back into the closet. Rather, as we continue to celebrate rightly greater queer visibility, it seems wise as well to investigate how we might extinguish the regrettable vulnerability that's accompanied the outness queer people have been able to express in the years since Stonewall and even the landmark Obergefell decision in 2015, close quote. And I appreciate that quote because it's a moment of being honest about the benefits of queer and trans representation, but also about the harm that can come therefrom. Our current political climate, which continues to grow more and more hostile toward LGBTQ youth, has been shaped in part by this record-setting number of anti-LGBTQ bills, around 300 plus, that swept state legislatures across the country this year. Most of those bills disproportionately targeted and impacted LGBTQ people, especially trans and non-binary folks and Black and Brown youth. It is heartbreaking, of course, to see state lawmakers work overtime to target and torment a group of marginalized communities that were already marginalized solely as a political tactic, especially when we realize that doing so can risk their own lives. And so, for me, while it is truly heartening to see more and more people live their truth, be exactly who they are, of course, we see so many representations of that in TV and media, and we see them being vocal and visible about what it means to be queer, trans, and non-binary. The fact of the matter is that being visible can also mean being subjected to harm. And unfortunately, while many people speak about what it means to come out, or as I prefer to call it, invite in, we rarely discuss the harm that can happen when one may do so with minimal support, and especially with lack of social safety nets. And so that is why enshrining protections and rights for LGBTQ people through legislation at all levels, local, state, and federal, and working to educate others and increase societal acceptance is really pivotal for the health and well-being of LGBTQ young people.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you. I actually wrote down the article that you just mentioned, because that was a fascinating quote. And I think it's something that we actually need to delve a little bit deeper into in some of these conversations, because I feel like that the conflating of these two ideas is really, it's not only wrong, I think it actually is kind of a dangerous thing. So Doreen, you're looking at these statistics and a lot of these numbers on a larger scale, not just with the LGBTQ lens. And, we've heard so much more, particularly in the last 2 years since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, about the importance of mental health. More and more people talking about their experiences, people of high stature, people who have, amplified voices. And yet we are seeing that rates of depression and even towards suicide and suicidal ideation continue to increase in many respects. What is happening? Where is this disconnect happening? Because one would think with more examples, there would be more people reaching out for help, but that's not really it.
Yeah, well, it's a complex picture, and it's probably one we're going to be understanding for a long time, as we kind of understand what the data is telling us. I think one thing that I've been saying a lot, like we all experienced the pandemic over the last few years, but we didn't all have the same experience of the pandemic. And so when you look at that at a group level, a community level, by race, by age, there's differences. One of the things when we think about our LGBT youth, that school for some of them was an environment where they actually felt safe, right? And it may be safer than home. And so when schools shut down, they were kind of pulled away from what felt like a primary environment. For others, the opposite was true, right? School was a tough environment that actually they experienced less distress when school wasn't in person. So all that to be said, I think that's the key takeaway here is that at an individual level, this looks different, right? And so I think what's happened that's been positive, though, and this is your point, is that more resources are being promoted. I've heard more influencers talking about mental health publicly. And I think anytime you have people do that, it kind of changes the national conversation. So that gives me a lot of hope. But we're not done. And clearly, like, we're going to need to promote resources and support for a long time.
Yeah, it is really complicated. And I think you're right. As you delve into different communities and you look at the different factors of how people were impacted, it really gets complicated. I was actually just reading something right before we got on the air about a connection of people with long COVID experiences and suicide, and that they're starting to track numbers on that. So there's all of these different pieces coming out of where we've been. So Preston, when I'm talking to people and trying to teach, and we get into statistics and we talk about the relationship between LGBTQ identities and suicide attempts or suicidal ideation, people put these two ideas together, and they are connected, but they're probably not connected in the way some people think. I think some people think the identity itself is what leads to this. Could you correct that for people and explain how you talk about what the connection between identity and potential self-harm is?
Yeah, I always love to correct the record for this because, when it comes to the public health crisis for LGBTQ youth suicide, it is important to understand that these young people are not inherently prone to suicide risk because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, but because LGBTQ youth are placed at a higher risk based on mistreatment and stigmatization by society. And we go into this a bit more, but our 2022 national survey on LGBTQ youth mental health found that 73% of LGBTQ youth reported experiencing discrimination based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And so, and that's a large number. Previous research also shows that a majority of LGBTQ youth in middle and high school experience bullying, and discrimination and bullying are two examples of what we refer to as forms of anti-LGBTQ victimization. And those are risk factors for LGBTQ youth to be more associated with more than double the odds of attempting suicide in the past year. So again, it is not anything that's inherent with being LGBTQ. It is because of the way LGBTQ youth are treated, or mistreated rather, and stigmatized by society. And with that point, it's also important that we address intersectionality to understand the unique experiences that LGBTQ youth who hold multiple marginalized identities experience, right? Because our research has also shown that, increased disparities in suicide risk for trans and non-binary youth and LGBTQ youth of color highlight these devastating impacts of historical and ongoing oppression and trauma inflicted on BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as this societal level of systemic levels of oppression, such as cisgenderism and even racism. So that is why it's really important to correct the record always, right? I've had far too many conversations, unfortunately, with people who believe that there is something inherent about LGBTQ youth, right, that increases their risk or chance of ideation attempts, et cetera. But it's really the way many of us have been treated our entire lives and how that actually works over time, right? And how we feel about ourselves over time even.
Yeah, a lifetime of experiencing discrimination, marginalization. Even if you are incredibly strong and say there's nothing wrong with me, that does create pressure, and it's constant pressure. And I think a lot of people don't get that. Thank you for that. I feel like it's one of more of those conversations that we cannot have enough, because it's so easy for people to make the wrong connection there, and some of them actively do. So, Doreen, this week's article addresses a conversation that I've really seen pick up in media a lot over the last couple of weeks about the 988 hotline, which is that in some cases, law enforcement may be contacted and brought into a situation. Now, just to be clear, in the article that we shared today, there was a statistic given that 98% of the calls have some kind of resolution inside of the call. It's only about 2% of the cases when somebody is actually going to be deployed to go to someone and actually help. So can you help people understand a little bit more about what the role of law enforcement is in terms of what they can and can't do? Because I mean, especially as we look in some communities, this is a very scary prospect.
Yeah, and I want to say Preston's organization, the Trevor Project, has been an amazing partner, as have others, in terms of the 988, getting 988 established and that legislation. But I think what you're asking is an important question, and also an opportunity to clarify things. Like you said, and most of the calls, a vast majority of the calls, are going to be resolved really by having a trained listener talk with the person, share some resources. That's going to resolve most of them. Very occasionally, there's a need to involve law enforcement. But what we should remember is that, one, that happens in a very rare instance where there's an immediate danger. So you might imagine an attempt in progress in a way where first aid might even be needed, right? We're talking about a really small number of calls. Plus, the other thing I think a lot of people have been concerned about, that's a bit of a misinformation, is that if I call, suddenly someone's going to know where I am, where I live. And we should be mindful that we don't quite have that technology, meaning, the calls are routed based on area code, right? But most of us have cell phones. So it's not as precise. And I hope for some people that alleviates some of the fear that someone's going to knock on their door just because they make a phone call. I can assure you that in the instances when that is deployed, it's a pretty high risk situation. Mm-hmm. All of that being said, I do think we'd be remiss to not recognize that for law enforcement to show up is not neutral for everyone. Right. And I think a lot of the efforts that are going on nationally are really around improving education and training for those that do respond to those calls, whether it's law enforcement, paramedics, first responders, EMTs, fire department, whoever it is that is going to respond to an emergency call, because some of those calls will still go to 911. Some people will not know the number and will dial 911. Mm-hmm. We want whoever responds to a suicidal person in distress to respond in a caring, compassionate, and helpful way. And that involves improving education and training for those that are in the role of responding.
Thank you. And just in terms of, if somebody's listening and they've spoken to somebody who really is concerned about this outcome, how would you suggest that they talk about it? Should they just point out that this is actually very rare? Is there anything else that you would add to that conversation if somebody that you're talking to said, I'm really afraid to use this?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't realize is you can call 988 on behalf of someone and say, I'm calling, I have someone with me who's struggling. You can call as a concerned person trying to figure out what resources may be helpful. Like, you don't have to be at a moment of terrible crisis to utilize the resource. So, I would often say, like, why don't we call and just give you a sense of what this resource is? And, as busy as 988 call responders are, they welcome those calls. And you can just call and say, I'm calling with someone who wants to learn about the number. Can you tell me a little bit what happens when I make this phone call? That way, the person who has the number and uses it the next day, the next year, whenever, they already have some experience of what's going to happen. I think that doing that can be really helpful. But also, not to be afraid to call with someone if they're having a hard time. So many of us make calls and put it on speakerphone. You can do that too with this number and really be there with the person that's needing the support.
Thank you. That is really useful. That really, and I think it would be kind of comforting to say we can do this together. You don't have to go at it alone. I'm here to help protect you. Thank you for that. So Preston, one of the things that comes up often in these conversations, especially around LGBTQ youth mental health, is the role of online interactions. We actually were talking about that last week on the show. One of the things I have frequently heard people say is if it's so bad out there for LGBTQ youth online, they should just stay offline for their own mental health. How do you respond to people who say this? Because I think people like you, and certainly Trevor knows, that can also be a lifeline too.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that because, I think sometimes, right, like folks want to offer the best of advice, but maybe doing so in a way that's actually more harmful than helpful. And so, what we say is, why it's true that online spaces can be a source for negativity among and for LGBTQ youth. Our 2022 national survey, for example, found that 42% of LGBTQ youth reported being bullied electronically. The fact is that the internet can also be an incredibly important safe space for LGBTQ youth to, I think of myself as an example, right? Like when I was inviting people in or learning more about myself when I was younger, social media and other platforms such as that was actually the thing that allowed me to connect with peers, connect with folks with shared identities, receive affirming support from others without judgment. And in many ways, it actually led to my own reduced feelings of isolation. And so I think oftentimes, right, it's a both and, right? Social media can certainly be a space for negativity. And that is obviously not the best experience for anyone to have. And it's such an important safe space for many people. LGBTQ youth in particular may find it helpful to utilize online communities through which they may feel more open to exploring and better understanding their own identity if they're not able to do so in their current environment, such as an unsupportive home or unaccepting school. In fact, only 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth identify their home as being LGBTQ affirming. And just a little over half identify their school as being an LGBTQ affirming space. So, for youth who may have to navigate these difficult circumstances around family rejection, lack of peer support, or even an inability to come out or live authentically, for safety reasons, that online support is a vehicle to access information and education and community and peer support and mental health resources, which of course we all know is critical for health and well-being. So, I would share, don't necessarily say that as an advice, right? Like don't tell people to not get online because we know online can be an affirming space, but it's how people navigate online and what resources they're using to navigate online. And that is why, online communities like our own Trevor space, again, the world's largest safe space social networking site for LGBT youth, exist, and why so many of our users think it is so important for them and really can help them not only survive, but thrive.
Thank you. And I think constantly pointing people to those affirming places is so important. I think you tend to find a lot, but there's a lot that we may know about that we can share. Also, I'd like to point to the presence of cat videos as one of the purposes the internet exists. And they're good for us all. So articles like this one, commemorations of weeks like this one, the launch of the 988 line, are really focused on crisis intervention. But there's a whole lot that happens before we get to a crisis, and there's a whole lot that can happen after somebody is in crisis. In fact, that's a really risky point in time. So I would love to hear from both of you. Maybe Doreen, we can start with you. Is there anything that our supporters, the people who are watching today, should be advocating for in terms of more preventative care? What is missing from this conversation that we need more of? And specifically things that people can advocate or talk about or work towards?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. I think first, we could all do better to up our understanding of mental health crises, of what we think of as warning signs around suicide. And we have a lot of that information at afsp.org, but really, having people pay more attention, noticing those changes in behavior, and then trusting our gut. I think a lot of us try and explain it away, but we have a sense something is not going well for this person, but we hold back. This is really a time to lean in when you notice somebody is struggling, to not be afraid to ask directly. Whoops. had something drop here. To not be afraid to ask directly, are you thinking about suicide? And I think then the point you made, which is really an important one, is that this is a process. That this is not I ask you once, I get an answer, and then I don't ever have to ask again, or I don't ever have to check in again. We want to stay with people through the course and through the process of treatment, of healing, of finding ways to work through the distress they're experiencing. So if you know someone who's struggling, I think that the best thing I can say is be there. Learn some things, learn some resources, and listen. I think we underestimate how important it can be to just give someone a safe, non-judgmental space where it's, whatever you're going through, I'm here for you and I'm here to hear it. What a gift that is for people. If we can just start there, in addition to learning more, sharing resources, and all of the things, I think we'd be in a really better space, because that's what folks need, a non-judgmental space where someone will listen to them.
Thank you. And I appreciate you saying it's not just once, it's checking in a lot, and it's a process, that it's not this sort of one and done. And I think that's a really important message. Preston, you're actually quoted in the article that we shared, mentioning about sort of the services that are necessary, but also that there is legislation that would be relevant here. Can you talk a little bit about what you think also needs to exist?
I think I can really sum this up rather quickly in really what is it that we need to do to transform our mental health care system and expand access to affordable and culturally competent and responsive mental health care for those most in need. So we need to protect LGBTQ youth from dangerous and discredited practices of conversion therapy, yes. Right? And sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts, critically important. Schools, of course, are a critical place too, as this is where young people spend their most waking hours, quite frankly. We can dramatically improve school-based environments, which includes enacting LGBTQ inclusive mental health counseling and suicide preventions every single place across the country. And frankly, we must understand that LGBTQ people exist in every single communities, right? So that is why we must have intersectional and interconnected approaches and not one-dimensional and one-size-fits-all models. I think so often when I hear people say things like mental health isn't for me, it breaks my heart, because what it's taught me is that, many people, and I think some of us in the community have to take blame, unfortunately have presented mental health in a vacuum or in a silo or in something that's like the same for every person. And we all have different experiences with mental health and wellness, including like therapy. And so I think part of this is we must be very honest about people's intersectional or interconnected identities to make it really better. And I think actually part of that can be encompassed within legislation as well.
Had myself on mute. Thank you so much for that. And I think what both of you are really getting to is this point, and I know everybody's tired of the phrase, but it does in fact take a village. There is no one way through this. There is no one solution for this. It is both personal, it is professional, it is legislative, it is a culture change conversation. It's complicated, but we're doing it. And I think the fact that this 988 number exists, so many people worked towards it, including organizations like yours, and are supporting it, really shows that things are beginning to change, but I think there's always so much more. So Doreen and Preston, thank you so much for being here. I could not have asked for more perfect people to have this conversation. It is a very personal one. I really appreciate you. And for everybody who's watching, please make sure that you're checking out Trevor Project, as well as AFSP, and getting some of those resources. But thank you both for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. As I said, this is a very personal conversation. It is hard to talk about, but I am in fact one of those people who did attempt suicide at one point. And I am telling you, the only reason I am here is because of allies and people in the mental health community who helped reconstruct me and put me back together again. So please do not be afraid of asking for help. Please ask for help when you need it. There's no shame in it, because on the other side, you'll be here to tell these stories someday and help someone else. So please reach out for help. Check out those two organizations. We have lots of resources on the PFLAG website at pflag.org. Before we sign off, I will remind you one more time about our Read with Love program. One of the great ways to feel affirmed is by actually seeing yourself on a bookshelf. And that can be done when you participate in Read with Love, where we are replenishing all of those LGBTQ affirming books and authors that are being stolen and taken off of our library shelves. You can learn more about how you can help by visiting pflag.org/readwithlove. That wraps up another show for everybody this week. I want to thank you for being here and really thank our guests for everything that they had to offer for today's conversation. We will be back next week with another fantastic conversation. Until then, remember, if you need help, visit us at pflag.org, and we will close out the way we do every single week, reminding you to laugh hard, run fast, and most of all, please be kind. I'll see you next week, everyone.